Thanks, Laura. In one of her articles, it was one she wrote for the Theosophist called "What Are the Theosophists?" Madame Blavatsky stated that, be what he may, once that a student abandons the old and trodden highway of routine and enters upon the solitary path of independent thought, Godward, he is a Theosophist, an original thinker, a seeker after the eternal truth, with an inspiration of his own to solve the universal problems. And this broad and non-sectarian description of what it means to be a Theosophist is echoed by the American Theosophist William Q. Judge, who, writing about the greater Theosophical movement, said that wherever thought has struggled to be free, wherever spiritual ideas, as opposed to forms and dogmatism, have been promulgated, there the great movement is to be discerned. So, thought struggling to be free from forms and dogmatism, the search for eternal truth, for self-knowledge, is mind on fire. It is mind waking up. Or as Thoreau put it, moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. And what a fitting description of that constellation of brilliant minds which congregated in New England in the early and mid-19th century, known as the New England Transcendentalists. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are the most remembered and most familiar to us today. Others included Bronson Alcott, Margaret Fuller, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Walt Whitman. And one might very well say that they were the Theosophists of that era. So to say a few words about the Transcendentalist movement in general, what it was, from what did it arise, what did they teach, what did they espouse? And in this regard, it is really impossible to define it precisely, because there was no Transcendentalist creed or articles of faith, and no one book or prophet that they gathered around. But the philosophy of Transcendentalism did center around some essential concepts. And in his lecture called The Transcendentalists, delivered in 1842, Emerson pointed out many of them and traced the term back to Immanuel Kant. And Emerson writes this: what is popularly called transcendentalism among us is idealism. Idealism as it appears in 1842. As thinkers, mankind have ever divided into two sects, materialists and idealists. The first class founding on experience, the second in consciousness. The first class beginning to think from the data of the senses. The second class perceive that the senses are not final, and say the senses give us representations of things, but what are the things themselves? They cannot tell. The materialists insist on facts, on history, on the forces of circumstances, and the animal wants of man. The idealists on the power of thought and of will, on inspiration, on individual culture. So the primacy of mind, of thought and will as a force in nature was a key element in the transcendentalist view of the world. Emerson wrote in his essay on fate, every solid in the universe is ready to become fluid on the approach of the mind, and the power to flex it is the measure of the mind. If the wall remain adamant, it accuses the want of thought. And he said that the whole world is the flux of matter over the wires of thought to the poles or points where it would build. And in that same essay, he says that fate then is a name for facts that are not yet passed under the fire of thought, for causes which are unpenetrated. In other words, it is through mind, through the inner dialogue of the dialectic, that our wisdom and understanding develops and grows, that we acquire a clearer perception of the flow of causes and effects, and we discern meanings. There's a book by a writer named Harold Goddard. Came out, it's over 100 years ago now, but it's a book called Studies in New England Transcendentalism. And he summarizes some key ideas that they embraced. He points out that they all approach these concepts in their own way, and some placing more emphasis in one area than another, and couch it in their own intellectual framework. But in general, these were the main concepts of the Transcendentalists. First, we have the unity of the world and God, and the immanence of God in the world. I mean, God is not something outside of us. It's within. And the idea of each individual soul with the soul of the world, or what Emerson calls the oversoul. The prime importance of self-reliance and individualism. The essential unity of all religions. A disregard for all external authority and for tradition. And always underlying all else is the fundamental belief in the identity of the individual soul or God or deity as an unshakable faith, and an unshakable faith in the divine authority of the intuitions of the soul. As Emerson wrote in his essay on self-reliance, nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. The New England Transcendentalist movement emerged in the 1830s, and it centered around Boston and Cambridge and Concord. It was in some ways an outgrowth of Unitarianism, which had arisen as in the 18th century as a more liberal and a less dogmatic response to Calvinism. And by the in the early 19th century, it had pretty much dominated the Harvard Divinity School. Emerson's father was a Unitarian minister, and Emerson himself went to Harvard Divinity School and was a member of the clergy until he resigned in 1832 over some doctrinal disputes. And while the Unitarian Church was indeed less dogmatic and more liberal in its views than the stern Calvinism it eventually displaced, by the 1820s and 30s, it had, in the opinion of some, become stale and settled and uninspired and stuck in its ways. A man considered one of the first of the Transcendentalists was a Unitarian minister named Ellery Channing. And although he remained connected with the church, he was keenly aware of its shortcomings. And he wrote this in 1820. I have before told you how much I think Unitarianism has suffered from union with a heart-withering philosophy. I will now add that it has suffered also from a too exclusive application of its advocates to biblical criticism and theological controversy. In other words, from too partial culture of the mind. I fear that we must look to other schools for the thoughts which thrill us, which touch the most inward springs, and disclose to us the depth of our own souls. Goddard writes that the typical Unitarian of that time was a man of tolerance and great intellect and cultured tastes, of unexceptionable private morality and notable civic virtue, as well as many other admirable qualities. But he was not either metaphysical or emotionally spiritual in his temperament, and philosophy and enthusiasm he did not have. Yet philosophy and enthusiasm were exactly the things which his religion stood most lamentably in need. I was quoting Harold Goddard. And it was indeed this lack of enthusiasm, this lack of philosophy and independent thought that Emerson pointed out in his address to the Harvard Divinity School in 1838. He pointed out that preaching about Jesus as a deity outside of the human realm and beyond any possibility of human reach, instead of as someone illuminated by divine wisdom towards which we all can aspire. In doing so, the church has created a kind of a monster. Emerson he wrote that. I have a couple of quotes here from this address that he gave to the Harvard Divinity School. In how many churches, by how many prophets, tell me, is man made sensible that he is an infinite soul, that the earth and heavens are passing into his mind, that he is drinking forever the soul of God. The faith should blend with the light of rising and setting suns, with the flying cloud, the singing bird, and the breath of flowers. But now the priest's Sabbath has lost the splendor of nature. It is unlovely. We are glad when it is done. That is always best, which gives me to myself. The sublime is excited in me by the great Stoical doctrine, obey thyself. That which shows God in me fortifies me. That which shows God out of me makes me a wart and a wen. There is no longer a necessary reason for my being. Already the long shadows of untimely oblivion creep over me, and I shall decease forever. And Emerson was not invited back to speak at the Divinity School for over 30 years. The New England Transcendentalist movement is generally considered to have begun with the formation of the Transcendental Club in Boston in 1836. It was an informal gathering of men and women interested in meeting together to discuss the new views of philosophy and theology and literature. And initially, the group consisted of Emerson and Bronson Alcott and a few others, later joined by Margaret Fuller and Thoreau and Theodore Parker and Nathaniel Hawthorne and many others. And in 1840, a transcendental magazine was started up called The Dial with Margaret Fuller as the editor. The journal discussed theology and philosophy, and it contained papers on art and music and literature, and contained translations of Oriental scriptures, and it also had a lot of poetry. It was never terribly successful financially, and it lasted, I think, for a couple of years. But the Transcendentalists did indeed look to other schools, as Channing said. Emerson and Thoreau and Fuller and Alcott especially were deep students of Greek philosophy. They studied Plato and the Neoplatonists. And they studied the Eastern philosophy, including the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita, which had first been translated into English towards the end of the 18th century. They had a familiarity with the classics of Greece and Rome that was typical of well-educated people in the 19th century. So the New England Transcendentalism was indeed a time of intellectual brilliance and awakening, of mind on fire, in which the light of the ancient wisdom shone and found a home. Madame Blavatsky didn't say too much about the Transcendentalists, but she did say this in an article called 1888. The American Transcendentalists discovered that life could be made a sublime thing without any assistance from circumstances or outside sources of pleasure and prosperity. Of course, this had been discovered many times before, and Emerson only took up again the cry raised by Epictetus. But every man has to discover this fact freshly for himself, and when once he realized it, he knows that he would be a wretch if he did not endeavor to make the possibility a reality in his own life. The Transcendentalist had faith in the unknown and untried possibilities which lay within himself. A passage from Emerson's journal, which is often quoted, is life consists of what a man is thinking about all day. Mind, or man thinking, the examined life, was of central importance to the Transcendentalists, a turning towards a higher, deeper, more connected inner life through alignment with the intuitive, universal realm of what Emerson called the oversoul, a beam of which is reflected within the heart of every human being. Within man, says Emerson, is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. Now, in keeping with the overall theme of this series of discussions, the higher and lower aspects of mind, I want to offer some selections from the writings of Emerson and Thoreau, who were the most prolific and deeply philosophical writers among the Transcendentalists. The first is from Thoreau's essay, Life Without Principle. And we find this, and we'll have our wonderful reader read it for us. But I just wanted to say that first, before we start with the reading, that the word macadamized, which you see here, is not a very familiar word. And what that word means is paved over. So when he says macadamized, he means it's just kind of covered over and with pavement. So we'll start the reading.
It is so hard to forget what it is worse than useless to remember. If I am to be a thoroughfare, I prefer that it be of the mountain brooks, the Parnassian streams, and not the town sewers. There is inspiration, that gossip which comes to the ear of the attentive mind from the courts of heaven. There is the profane and stale revelation of the barroom and the police court. The same ear is fitted to receive both communications. Only the character of the hearer determines to which it shall be open and to which closed. I believe that the mind can be permanently profaned by the habit of attending to trivial things, so that all our thoughts shall be tinged with triviality. Our very intellect shall be macadamized, as it were, its foundation broken into fragments for the wheels of travel to roll over. And if you would know what will make the most durable pavement, surpassing rolled stones, spruce blocks, and asphaltum, you have only to look into some of our minds which have been subjected to this treatment for so long. If we thus have desecrated ourselves, as who has not, the remedy will be by wariness and devotion to reconcentrate ourselves and make once more a fane of the mind. We should treat our minds, that is, ourselves, as innocent and ingenious children whose guardians we are, and be careful what objects and what subjects we thrust on their attention. Read not the times, read the eternities. Conventionalities are at length as bad as impurities. Even the facts of science may dust the mind by their dryness, unless they are in a sense effaced each morning, or rather rendered fertile by the dews of fresh and living truth.
Recalled very much to mind the statement in The Voice of the Silence, where she says, "The mind is like a mirror. It gathers dust while it reflects. It needs the gentle breezes of soul wisdom to brush away the dust of our illusions. Seek, O beginner, to blend thy mind and soul." We find in one of Emerson's best-known essays on self-reliance what must be one of the most splendid descriptions or characterizations of what Theosophists call the higher mind, or buddhi-manas. In this essay, he speaks of the supreme importance of fearlessly trusting in yourself, of not allowing yourself to be driven by convention or the expectations of others. To believe your own thought, he says, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all men, that is genius. Trust yourself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. And it is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after your own. But the great man is he who, in the midst of the crowd, keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. And with respect to the idea of self-reliance, he poses the question, what is the aboriginal self on which such a universal reliance may be grounded? And here we have our next reading.
This is from Ralph W. Emerson, and it's called The Oversoul. What is the nature and power of that science-baffling star without parallax, without calculable elements, which shoots a ray of beauty even into trivial and impure actions, if the least mark of independence appear? The inquiry leads us to that source, at once the essence of genius, of virtue, and of life, which we call spontaneity or instinct. We denote this primary wisdom as intuition, whilst all later teachings are tuitions. In that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. For the sense of being, which in calm hours rises, we know not how in the soul, is not diverse from things, from space, from light, from time, from man, but one with them, and proceeds obviously from the same source whence their life and being also proceed. Here is the fountain of action and thought. Here are the lungs of that inspiration which giveth man wisdom, and which cannot be denied without impiety and atheism. We lie in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity. When we discern justice, when we discern truth, we do nothing of ourselves but allow a passage to its beams.
I should say that's not from his essay on the Oversoul. That's from his essay on self-reliance. That was a mistake that got in there somehow. I wanted to add this quotation from Thoreau's essay on walking. It's one of the last pieces he wrote before his death in 1862. My desire for knowledge is intermittent, but my desire to bathe my head in atmospheres unknown to my feet is perennial and constant. The highest that we can attain to is not knowledge, but sympathy with intelligence. I do not know that this higher knowledge amounts to anything more definite than a novel and grand surprise on a sudden revelation of the insufficiency of all that we had called knowledge before. A discovery that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy. It is the lighting up of the mist by the sun. Man cannot know in any higher sense than this, any more than he can look serenely and with impunity in the face of the sun. And I thought we'd close with this final reading from Thoreau's book, Waldo. And I think we have this, do we ever, the recording set up for this? We can go ahead and start that.
The Vedas say all intelligences awake with the morning. Morning is when I am awake and there is a dawn in me. Moral reform is the effort to throw off sleep. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 million to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by a conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture or to carve a statue and to make a few objects beautiful. But it is far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. Every man is tasked to make his life, even in its details, worthy of the contemplation of his most elevated and critical hour.
I hope we've been able to kind of show, at least, give people a kind of a flavor of the minds of these wonderful thinkers of the Transcendentalist movement. And I wanted to point out that there's just a wonderful series that that Ken Burns has done on the life and writings of Henry David Thoreau. It's kind of a documentary biography of Thoreau, which it's just really stunning in how well it's done. And I would just recommend everybody try to see that. It's just now coming out and on the public broadcasting stations. And so that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ, very much.